Good morning. Welcome to Trinity United Methodist Church this morning. Today we have the honor of welcoming back a former pastor to do the service. John Sumwalt is here.
It is a joy to be in Montello and to be in this place, in this church, which holds so many memories for Joe and I. Joe is right back there. Joe, would you stand so they can see who you are? Joe hasn't changed. It's a joy to look on your shining faces. I recognized a lot of you. I was talking to Dennis Shrimp when we came in and said, I went to my 50th class reunion, went in to the room and looked around, and there were all these old people there. And I hadn't changed at all. Joe and I walked around the town yesterday and back to the old neighborhood, past the old church, and to Daisy Lane, where we lived, and just brought back so many memories. We loved living here. Our kids were born. This is going to take a long time because I have to stop and cry every once in a while. Our kids were born here. Katie has 2 daughters, and she and Mark and Phoebe and Faye live in Maryville, Missouri. Katie's a 4th grade teacher. Orrin and Kelly live in Wauwatosa, where we served for 14 years. They have 2 sons, Leo Leonard, named after my father, and Liam William. And we live just 10 miles from them in Menominee Falls. But we love coming back to Montello. I had a sleep study on Wednesday night at the local hospital because I've got a sleep disorder. And if I fall asleep in the middle of this, Susan will have to finish it for me. If any of you fall asleep, you're on your own. Before the triumphal parade into Jerusalem, before Jesus mounted the donkey and the crowds threw their cloaks in front of him and waved their palm branches and shouted, Hosanna, there was an argument. Just before they got to Jerusalem, there was a big disagreement among Jesus' followers, which ended with all the disciples being angry with one another. And Jesus, as usual, had to step in and set them straight. It began with the mother of James and John, the so-called sons of thunder, sons of Zebedee. Now, their mom was not a shy woman. She marched right up to Jesus and demanded, didn't you hate it when you were a kid in school and your parents stepped in, tried to set somebody straight? She walked up to Jesus and demanded, declare that these 2 sons of mine will sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom. Now when the other 10 disciples heard this, they were angry with the 2 brothers. Because the 2 brothers were mama's boys. They didn't mind this. Just before the big parade into Jerusalem, the disciples were fighting. Everything was falling apart. And we all know this story. It happens all the time in our everyday lives, in families, at work, at school, and on the playground. It happens all the time in churches, especially in churches. Years ago in this community, we had a little disagreement about books. Anybody remember that? If Montello is anything like where Joe and I live in Menominee Falls, you are probably still arguing about that. And it is worth arguing about as American citizens and as followers of Jesus. If we are not arguing about the big things that affect all of our lives, and you name it, it's a long list, we are probably not paying attention, or we are intentionally burying our heads in the sand. We had a little disagreement right here in this room 42 years ago, just 2 weeks before we moved here from the old church. The sanctuary was not quite finished yet. The pews had not yet been brought over. They were still putting up the lights. And we met around 2 tables right in the middle there. I kept a journal in those days, and I will read you what I wrote about that little disagreement. But before I do that, I want to give you a sample of the kinds of things I recorded in that journal. Joe and I moved to Montello in June of 1978, right after I graduated from seminary at the University of Dubuque. And we got here on a Saturday night. I was to preach on Sunday, but our belongings did not arrive on the moving van until the next day. So we stayed at a little motel, same place we stayed last night. It's now called Tween the Lakes. And somebody told me that Fred Cartwright was going to be the liturgist the next day. And I decided I need to take the bulletin out to Fred. We went over to Jimmy's snack bar and had supper, and Jimmy gave us directions out to the Cartwright farm. Pulled up in front of the barn, and Fred came out. They were milking cows. He was dressed very much like my farmer dad in his bib overalls, and like all the other farmers I grew up with in Richland County, and I felt right at home. So Fred and I talked about milking cows and farming, and we got around to the church, and Fred was about the same size as my dad, just a little taller than me. And when we left, Fred shook my hand and he said, "I think we're going to see eye to eye." And we did. The following Monday, after that first service, I stopped at Leon's Bakery to meet Ernie and Leon Voland. They gave me some of their wonderful sweet rolls, and they wouldn't let the new preacher pay. Then I stopped at the Marquette County Tribune offices to meet the newspaper editor, Bob Wright, who allegedly was a member of the church, though I never saw him here until I did his funeral. And he took my picture, and he invited me out to the house to meet Marion. So I went out there, and I discovered that the interview wasn't done yet. And Marion served us iced tea and cookies in the living room, and then Bob invited me downstairs to the basement for some ping pong. Now, I was a very good ping pong player, I thought, but Bob took me to school. Spikes and all over the place. I was ducking like an inebriated goose. He invited me to come back anytime for another game, and he also wrote a very nice article about me, introducing me to the community. Now, there were a number of humiliating comeuppances like that during our time in Montello. Like the day I put on my best suit and went over to the funeral home for a visitation. People were sitting at the Steinhaus Funeral Home then, right over here, in a big circle, and I made the rounds, shaking hands with everybody, and I got around to Tom, and Tom took me aside, and very quietly in his funereal voice, he said, "John, your fly is open." Hard to be dignified after that. Then there was a time I filled up the car at the Shell station and drove off without paying Ole Gardner. Ole was fortunately a church member, and he called the church office and told me what I had done. I was just glad he didn't call the sheriff. I started my Montello journal in April of 1980. In one of the first entries, I wrote, "Hottest day ever in April, 94 degrees. Planted peas, radishes, spinach, marigolds, and lettuce in the little garden plot behind the parsonage. It was just below the granite wall that separated the church property from Izzy Baxter's yard." You remember Izzy? I wrote, "Put horse manure on the garden." Alan Christensen, the postmaster, told me that fresh horse manure might burn the root crops. I wrote, "We'll see." It didn't. Speaking of horse manure, are you allowed to say horse manure in the pulpit? I've been accused of it more than once. Another one of the first entries was about books. I wrote on April 15th, 1980, "Attended a controversial school board meeting last night." At issue was the censorship of certain library books considered obscene by a vocal minority of concerned citizens. It was a long entry about what I said at the meeting and a harsh exchange between a couple of members from our church. If we had several hours, I'd tell you the whole story about the book controversy, about the helicopters from the CBS News and ABC News and NBC that landed on the football field, about how CBS News came to one of our worship services and filmed it one day, and how I went to a school board meeting one night and the sheriff, Kelly Campion, made a point of sitting right beside me. I thought, well, this is odd. I wasn't there to cause trouble. He told me later that the posse comitatus had let it be known that there might be violence at that meeting, so he was protecting me, and I was forever grateful. You remember the literature that was floating around at that time? The posse was accusing high school teachers of teaching communism. There was a lot more that went on, but I will save that for another time. Suffice it to say that it was an interesting time. I defended our teachers and spoke out in favor of free speech. I was afraid that the church might lose members. In fact, we grew. I'll never forget the night that Joanne Schwitz, who was an English teacher at the high school, called me and asked for my support on the book issue. It was January 17, 1981. Joanne said she was worried and had decided to talk to as many people as possible. I asked her about coming to church. She was hesitant. I asked her to come because the church needs her and she needs the church. I also said I would feel affirmed and I need your support. Joanne said, then I'll be there. I hope I can contribute something. That Sunday, she and Miff and Becky were in church. On March 8, 1982, 2 months later, when I preached a key sermon on the issue which got written up in the papers, there were 9 teachers present. Now, most of my journal entries were more mundane, like this one. January 15, 1981, visited Gary, Linda, Jocelyn, and Angela Cartwright this evening. They plan to join the church and have Angela baptized. Gary showed me the abstracts to their farm, has been in the family for 6 generations. Kids always had the best comments in church. On January 19th, 81, I wrote, during concerns and celebrations today, Stephanie Sabelski announced, Julie went to the hospital to get her butt fixed. Brought down the house. On the Sunday that one of Larry and Kathy Becker's babies was being baptized, when we came to the part of the service where I always said, as the ushers come forward, let us bring our tithes and offerings, the oldest Becker boy stood up and started to take off his tie. Kathy told me afterwards that when she said, what are you doing? He said, pointing at me, the preacher, he wants my tie. January 21st, 1981, visited the care center. Louis Johnston said, it just makes me heartsick to be here after being together with my wife for 57 years. We prayed for the last 20 years that we wouldn't have to go to a place like this. February 15th, 1981, my 31st birthday. 155 in worship, 1 baptism, 1 confirmation, took in 9 new members, congregation sang happy birthday. When I carried Angela Cartwright down the aisle after her baptism, I handed her to her great-grandmother, Mary Cartwright, and Mary kissed her. It was one of those holy moments. Everybody felt it. That afternoon of the same day, 12 members of the choir went with me to do the worship service at the Oxford Federal Prison. They never sang better. Inspired. Bunny Paul's rendition of the Lord's Prayer moved me to tears. Finished to many amens from inmates. 2 prisoners, John Lawrence and Stan Robinson, read Scripture, and after passing the peace, we all shared communion by intinction around the altar. 12 inmates were present. We visited with them for a long time afterwards. They want us to come back soon. The Spirit was truly present. We went to the Pioneer Restaurant in Westfield for lunch afterwards. Is that still there, the Pioneer? Yeah. February 23rd, 1981. Visited Jack Robinson and Doris North at St. Mary's Hospital in Madison. Jack said his Aunt Edna Ritchie had been to see him. Gave him 2 big kisses. He said, almost worth having the operation for that. She's hardly spoken to me for 10 years. May 7th, 1981, hectic day in the office. Jane Kronschnabel, our church secretary, was finishing the church newsletter. Man came from Partyville to fix the typewriter. A crew was in the basement to fold the newsletters, but had difficulty filling out the form without Eunice Hutchings, who was on vacation. Eunice was the indispensable woman. That afternoon, I visited Helen Umbehound. She had a snake in her living room last night, a 4-foot pine snake. Called Mark and Shelley Robinson to come over and get it out. There were 3 more in the basement. She is beside herself, doesn't know what to do, has had Jim Kronschnabel from the DNR to look at the problem. Now, I'm afraid of snakes. I said a prayer and I got out of there as fast as I could. On January 15th, 1981, I wrote, visited Carol Kaufman at Hometown Village. Anybody remember Carol? No? Carol told me of a floating sensation she experienced once when she was near death. And she described a vision she had of her son's lifeblood flowing out from him. She said the next morning she received a cable from Korea saying her son had been shot. Carol also told me how her late mother came to her at night one time to tell her how to correct a stitch in some knitting she was doing. As the years went on, I began to hear more and more people tell about experiences like that. They didn't teach us about these kinds of things in seminary. I began to pay closer attention. Years later, when I was pastor at Wauwatosa Avenue, I heard a remarkable angel story from John McLaughlin. John and Mary used to come to the chapel service. We had 3 services at Wauwatosa Avenue at that time, 8 o'clock in the chapel and 9 o'clock and 10:30 in the sanctuary. John and Mary were always there in the same place, and then Mary got cancer, and she ended up at St. Joseph's Hospital in Milwaukee. And I went to see John a few weeks after the funeral, and he said, John, I want to tell you something. He said, I was sitting there with Mary. He said, I was sort of half dozing. He said, I saw 3 angels come in through the window. One stood at the foot of the bed, one on each side of the bed. He said, John, I watched them as they lifted her spirit out of her body and carried it out the window. He said, I called the nurse and they came and she had passed. He said, it was so vivid. He said, John, I want you to tell people what I saw. And so I do. And that story and stories I've heard here are among the reasons that I wrote 4 books on visions and angels and mystical experience. Some of those are available at my cost, $10 a piece in the narthex today. Because I felt people need to hear these kinds of stories. And we tend not to tell them. Whenever I go out and tell these kinds of stories, people will come up to me afterwards and they'll very quietly tell me about an experience like this. And you know what they say? But I've never told anybody before. It may have happened 60 years ago, and it's the most meaningful spiritual experience in their life, and they never told anybody. Do you know why? Because people will think I'm crazy. And so I tell the stories to let people know they're not alone and that they should feel free to tell them. And I encourage people, write your story down. Pass it on to your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren so that your witness is carried on down through the generations. I will never forget the day I ran into Marion Wright at St. Mary's Hospital in Madison. She and her sister were waiting for Bob to come back from getting a biopsy on his neck. When I returned to check in later, Marion told me the news couldn't be worse. Bob has multiple myeloma in his bones. Bob was philosophical about it, as he was about everything. And after he had been home for a few weeks, he had Marion call me to come over the day after his 64th birthday. It was May 27th, 1981. This time there was no ping pong. Bob told me he was the only one who was not surprised by the news of his terminal illness. He said, "I have had an intuitive sense about it for 2 years, ever since I felt the pain in my bones." And he said, "I have an epitaph for those who thought I was a hypochondriac. I told you I wasn't feeling well." Bob always had something smart to say. He winked at me and said, "If I can't leave them laughing, I ain't going." His was one of the last funerals we did at the old church, and it was packed with people, and there were 25 people from the Wisconsin Newspaper Association in red vests sitting right up front. It was a powerful day. On October 21st, 1982, I wrote, "Went to a neighborhood meeting at Leo and Nola Campbell's last night to discuss the long-range planning report. Bob and Edie Rowe, Dale and Betty Daniels, Fred and Jean Cartwright, Linda Daniels, Arliss Olson, and Esther Galbraith were there. All seemed in favor of building a new church. Nola Campbell said she wanted to be able to attend worship when she was old and using a cane, and she got to do that. Esther Galbraith said to me as we were leaving, 'Well, I guess we better get started on that new building.' Linda Daniels said it was time to take some big steps, especially for the sake of the children." Flash forward 2 years, September 20th, 1984, a month before we moved here from the old church. I wrote, "Worked with volunteers to help seed the berm on the south side of the new church." 9 days later, on September 29th, 1984, I wrote, "They're putting up walnut paneling in the sanctuary. It's completed in the narthex. Thank you, Shelley Robinson, for the walnut paneling." Shelley was the one on the building committee who said, "We need to have nice stuff in the church." And it still looks wonderful. And I wrote, "Grass is up on the south berm." October 17th, 1984, 10:30 p.m., I wrote, "Stained glass windows were installed today. The wallpaper in the sanctuary was also completed. It will indeed be a beautiful place to worship God. Harvest supper tonight, over 280 served, the most I've ever seen in the old church. It was crowded, but everyone was in good spirits. Many people signed up to help. A good feeling." Now we come to the little disagreement I told you about. It happened on October 30th, 1984, 11:07 p.m., I wrote, "This was 12 days before the move to the old church. The worship committee and the Sunday school teachers were having a meeting. Sunday school teachers were in that part of the building. The worship committee was here. In the last hour, the two groups came together. And there was a disagreement about when we should have the moving date for the old church, from the old church to the new church, and have the first worship service here. I won't go into the details of what that was about, but it was a lively discussion, strong feelings on both sides. And I thought we have got to make sure everybody gets heard and that we leave here with people feeling this was decided fairly. And I said, let's take a secret ballot. And we did, and the vote was, and I abstained, the vote was 11-10 to keep the original date. The building committee meetings were interesting in those last days too, and not always calm. One night we had a big debate about moving the stained glass windows from the old building to the new, and there was no question about moving them over here. The disagreement was about whether do we keep the memorial plaques. There were names under each of the windows. And the committee was about evenly divided. And again, the meeting was right here in the middle of the sanctuary before anything was finished. And it's funny how certain events stay in your memory. I can remember where everyone was sitting around the table on the building committee. At the head of the table was Bill Dow, our chair, now a retired local pastor. Next to him was Jim Paul, then Shelley Robinson, Linda Tanner, Krista Sharon, Wayne Reike, Herb Scheller, Eleanor Steinhaus, and Fred Cartwright sitting next to me. I could tell you stories about each one. Shortly after Bunny and Jim Paul joined the church, Jim came up to me at a coffee hour one Sunday morning. He put his arm around me in that insurance salesman way, and he said, "John, what are you going to do about your car insurance?" And I said, "Well, Orland Richards is always taking care of insurance for the Sumwalt family back in Richland County." And he said, "John, you know, a pastor in a local community ought to support the local businesses." Put his arm around me and hugged me and made that Jim Paul laugh. The next day, Jim became my insurance agent. Shelley Robinson babysat for our daughter Katie the day our son Orrin was born at St. Mary's Hospital in Madison. Now Bob Hayes, who was pastor at the Wautoma United Methodist Church at that time, where they had just built a new building the year before, he said to me, "John, whatever you do, do not have a baby the same year that you build a new church." We didn't listen. After I called with the good news about Orrin's birth, Wayne and Mary Reike brought Katie down to Madison to meet her new brother. Herb Scheller, as many of you know, was a well-known muck farmer in Marquette County, and Eleanor Steinhaus was a retired funeral director. She and her husband Carl operated Steinhaus Funeral Home in Montello from 1947 to 1976. They inherited the business from Eleanor's father, C.A. Cummings, who founded it in 1905. Now, Eleanor is known on the building committee as the one who saw to it that the front doors were high enough that her 6'8" grandsons could carry her coffin in on the day of her funeral. Remember, they played basketball for the UW. We all kind of ducked down under the table as we were discussing the stained glass windows and the plaques. And the matriarch and the patriarch, Herb and Eleanor, went at it tooth and nail. They were good friends. And when they finished, Fred Cartwright made some peace on the waters kind of comments, as Fred would, and we voted. And you can look around, you can see how the vote turned out. There will always be arguments and disagreements in and outside the church about little issues and big issues. And arguing is not a bad thing as long as we remember whose and who we are. Remember what Jesus said to the two wannabe sons of thunder who wanted to be great disciples and sit at his right and left hand, and what he said to the other 10 who were angry at them. He said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus said to those disagreeable, angry disciples, "Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink?" That is the standard for those of us who follow Jesus. Disagree. Be angry with one another. Just remember what we are about. Be a servant. Drink the cup that he drank. Jesus made sure the disciples got that right before the big parade into Jerusalem. I'm going to hold up a painting. I wondered if this was still here. Anybody ever notice this? It hangs in the hallway. I just went right up and took it down. That was a gift from the United Methodist Women. Pearl Hunborg was the president at that time. And it was dedicated on the first Sunday in the new church. And when we were in that parade from the old church to here, I carried a sign that said, "Offer them Christ." That's the theme of the painting. And that was the title of my first sermon in this new building. In the last service in the old building, I stepped up onto the chancel steps and said, "As Abraham followed the Lord's call to go to a new land, we now follow his call to move to a new house of worship. Before we go, we must say goodbye to this place where God has met with us for over a century. Here we have baptized our babies, confirmed our youth, celebrated our marriages, and mourned our dead." I think I cried that day too. It has been a holy place for us. Within these walls and through the relationships we have had with those who have gathered here, Sunday after Sunday, we have known God. It is hard to say goodbye to a place that holds so much meaning, but Scripture teaches us, and we know in our hearts, that the living God is not confined to any building or any geographical location, so we go where God calls us. This place, which was holy for us and which we use for our most sacred functions, we give back to the world for common uses. It's a bookstore now. It's going to be an antique store. We shall worship here no more. It shall be to us as any other place of business or house in God's world. I wrote in my journal the next day, the old church was full for the deconsecration service. About 25 of the older members sitting and over 100 standing around the walls of the now empty sanctuary. My memory is, and memories are faulty, whenever I write my columns, my brothers and my sister tell me they have different memories, so these are my memories. Mark Robinson, Paul Sveum, Wayne Reike, Vern Hunborg, and others from the Board of Trustees carried the altar out the door to Herb Scheller's pickup truck. I know I got Herb's truck right. Volunteers carried the symbols of our faith, the cross, the big pulpit Bible, even the fourth place trophy the softball team won in the Buffalo Days tournament that year. If we had time, I'd tell you about my remarkable pitching skills in those days. Brent Reike and Tricia Mueller carried the altar candles lit with the light of Christ. Those carrying the Christian and the American flags fell in behind the altar, followed by a host of children and adults carrying placards with the names of dozens of saints from the congregation. The names included Hazel Herrick, Bill Egley, Renee Mueller, Mike Kilbride, Gordon Ritchie, Mary Cartwright, Florence Cassier, Eleanor Steinhouse's mother and father, Mary and C.A. Cummings, and Isaac Smith, who was the circuit riding preacher who began the ministry in this area in 1848. Any of you remember carrying a sign that day? Yeah. Do you remember what it said? Whose name?
Well, they were labeled as saints of the church.
Right.
By name.
Right. You don't remember which name you carried?
I drove.
Oh, you drove? Okay. Joe pushed a stroller with our 7-month-old son, Orrin. Our 5-year-old daughter, Katie, carried a placard with June Norton's name. June had helped plan the kitchen in the new church. It was one of her regrets as she lay dying that she would not live to see it. I had promised June that she would be remembered on moving day. And what a powerful feeling it was to carry the names of all those saints and all that sacred history. The choir in their robes led us in singing hymns as we marched up East Montello Street, directed by Mary Reike. We rounded the corner between the Catholic and the Lutheran Church and headed up Church Street, past Steinhaus Funeral Home in those days. We were singing Amazing Grace as the new church building came into view. The words of the last verse are forever seared in memory. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. The Marquette County Tribune reported that 253 souls packed the new church sanctuary on that first Sunday. I asked Esther Galbraith. Do you remember Esther? There's a picture of her on the handout on the inside, first page. Esther was heart and soul, one of the spiritual leaders of the church at that time. Started the rummage sale, raised thousands of dollars for missions. It's the reason you still have that mission going today. I asked her to say a prayer of dedication. Esther stood right there at the end of that first pew. And when Esther said amen, we all knew we were home. Offer them Christ.